All right, thank you. We're going to take questions from the audience. I'll try, to the best of my ability, to recognize students, at least 50% in terms of questions asked. So the floor is open, and we have two people with microphones. So when you ask your question, you'll ask it into a microphone so everyone can hear it.
Yeah, shortly after 9/11, shortly after 9/11, September 11th, 2001, I think I was on your site, and what was your? I want you to be accurate about what your take was about that day, September 11th, 2001. Were you on a radio somewhere that day while 9/11 was happening? You were being interviewed somewhere in the world on the radio while that happened, and your comments about that day, if you recall.
You understand the question? Okay. Maybe we can give you a mic. Would you rather sit? Okay.
It's good for me to bounce around. At my age, it keep me alive, you know, which my enemies will may not like. Now, the problem here on the 9/11 thing, on the 3rd of January of 2001, I warned that the United States must expect soon, within probably that year, a terrorist attack which would enable the George W. Bush administration to take control of the United States. I was looking around the world at the conditions where this might be orchestrated. There were several. I didn't get the one that was key. I didn't look at the Saudi aspect of it. I didn't look at Prince Bandar. Because a certain section of the British intelligentsia, together with a certain section, a certain faction of Saudi Arabia associated with Prince Bandar, had set up, and the facts are all there that you need to know. The facts are there. 9/11 was a setup. And the purpose of the setup was to deliver a shock to the United States, which would enable what was intended to become the Bush administration to take over. But no one had the guts to say so publicly. Some people had suggestions of what this meant, and they were all the wrong suggestions. They were looking for a certain kind of conspiracy. They weren't looking for a top-down inside job. And the inside job were the British and the Saudis and certain people associated with the Bush family in the United States. They pulled it. Without that, the Bush dictatorship would never have occurred. Bush was a wimp, a total incompetent. He was an unproven alcoholic and a dope addict. He'd been sent down away from the Texas Air Guard, which he had assigned to. He was sent for a 1-year cure for cocaine, and he was never cured. He was just induced to behave himself. So this guy, this incompetent, was made into the president after getting him in there. And that corruption that he represented, together with Cheney and together with the British, was the fruit of our failure to deal with that. We behaved similarly in the case of the assassination of Kennedy. There was no lone assassin. There were no borrowings, no thing that would go with a loan. This was done by essentially a French-based unit, the same unit that was out to get de Gaulle. And that's why Johnson was concerned that 3 rifles were aimed at his neck if he didn't behave himself. So this was an operation against the United States of what some people would call a geopolitical significance. I know exactly what was done, and I don't know all the details, but I know exactly how this thing was done. We've investigated the thing, we've got the track on it, and nobody has the guts to say it. So what I say and what other people say is, in recognizing that that is the fact, not by going out in the street and saying this is what happened, won't work, too late, but by recognizing this is the fact, you act according to your understanding of the way things are being manipulated. And that's providing political leadership within the country which will understand that we are in a fight to save our civilization. And we have to take the positive actions, not necessarily the negative ones, the positive actions which will contribute to that effect.
Thank you. Next question? Yes, right here. Okay, review, and then we'll come back to you. Go ahead.
Sir, one of the taglines of the Republican Party lately in fighting Obama's stimulus plan has been to attack the New Deal and create, I guess, new history in saying that it didn't work. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, it's not exactly the way it is. It may look like that to some people. What we have here is the present administration is non-functional. There are two things you can say about it. Obama and his immediate economic advisors, led by Larry Summers, are an absolute disaster. And the sooner that Summers and these so-called economists, behaviorists, are out of government, the better. Now you look at the rest of the present administration and look at what the implications are of this difference. You have Hillary Clinton, who is doing an excellent job as Secretary of State. She's only one of a number of people who are also doing an excellent job in their functions in the federal government, the federal executive. There are a few lumps in there. There always are a few lumps in any government. But we have essentially the core of a good government, which is assembled around the candidacy of President Obama. He's turned out to be what I feared he would be, but I gave him the benefit of the doubt. And then when he went to Europe, went to England, there was no more any doubt to be given. He'd gone over to the enemy. And it's still, my view is, that only by recapturing him and knowing his psychology and putting him under adult supervision, so to speak, of his own cabinet and other competent people in the government, could we actually rescue this United States from this situation. That's my practical policy now. I'm not saying I'm promising that's going to happen. I'm saying that's what I'm trying to make happen. And I have a whole circle of people who are very close to that administration, who were originally going to be the advisors to Obama. And they've been shunted aside, just as Volcker was, shunted aside. Now, Volcker I often disagree with, but the man is competent, and he's honest. So you can fight with him all day long and disagree with him, but you respect the fact that he's honest and he's competent. And therefore you want to be able to argue with a guy like that because something good is going to come out of it. Even if he continues to be wrong, the very discussion will be fruitful in clarifying the issues and bringing people into the deliberation we need. So it's not a hopeless situation. It's a desperate one. It's like a war which we haven't won, which we could lose. And my concern is to save the United States. My hope is the only rational way without chaos is to have these bums like Larry Summers and the other clowns, a few of them, out of there. And I think the rest of the administration can put the president into captivity, so to speak. That is adult supervision, to cause him to make decisions, only decisions, which are not really harmful, and also some decisions which are essential. The key thing I concentrate upon is the only way we can save this planet, because the entire planet's going into a dark age. Now you have China, 1.4 billion people. India, 1.1. Russia is not a populous nation, but has tremendous territory with tremendous raw materials development, and also cultural skills. If you can put these together with the United States, in an effort to make a new initiative in terms of an international credit system, we can save the situation. It's clear to me we can save it right now. It won't be magic. It won't be prosperity all at once, but we can stop the bleeding and go back in a different direction up. Under these conditions, party doesn't mean anything. You had the head of the Democratic Party was a fascist at the time that Roosevelt was inaugurated. They had to get rid of him. You have the same thing on the Republican Party. I'm not too strong on partisanship. I believe if you're working in a party, you have to work within the party. But your objective is not to establish the victory of one party over the other. The objective of the political process is to bring people together out of the selection of the process of dialogue and to get up with a bipartisan solution, not as a compromise, but as a constructive step forward, to get people in a time of crisis, when an emergency is on, to act to save this nation and to bind themselves together for the common purpose of saving this nation and doing some good for the world at the same time. That's my perspective.
All right, yes, right down here. Yes. One of my students. So.
Thank you. Yes, my question is regarding Pakistan. What do you think will happen in Pakistan, and who is behind the Taliban, the weapons and the funds?
Okay. Well, the Taliban is an organization which is actually created as a part of the Afghanistan war that the Soviets were involved in. And it was done by the Saudis with about Wahhabi school techniques. Pakistan was already disintegrating in some respects. It was not disintegrated, but it was in a very precarious situation. Now, the turning point for the present crisis in Pakistan was the dumping of Musharraf. I'm not saying that Musharraf was a great hero. I was saying that he was capable of keeping the country together. And the concern I have is to prevent Pakistan from disintegration. The disintegration of Pakistan would cause a mess beyond belief. Now, the Taliban is a force which is controlled by the wrong side in Saudi Arabia. And that's the danger. It's where the Israeli role of the present Israeli government is crucial, because the Israeli government can take actions, despite the impotence of the government in global terms, to take actions which set forth a fire, which play upon the crisis in Pakistan, together with the British interests there. The other problem is the drug problem. Since the 1790s, the British Empire has been based on drugs. It's been the world's big drug trafficker. You want to ban drugs, you sort of have to put the Queen of England in a little cage, because she's shrinking now. The cage doesn't have to be too big. And in that case, what we should be fighting, we should not have troops in Afghanistan. We're stupid to have troops in Afghanistan. It's provocative. The British are sitting upon the area of Afghanistan in which the greatest drug production is occurring. What they have is slaves in there who, with the threat of a gun, are producing opium at a low price, actually a slave price, for British consumption. The British then take this stuff and transport it out of Pakistan, out of Afghanistan, into Europe as the international drug trade, so that a farmer in Afghanistan, who in the British-controlled area, where British troops control the area, not the other part, are growing opium, and they're getting maybe a few $100s worth for a year's crop. When that year's crop hits the European market, it's in millions of dollars. The entire world economy, largely controlled by the British, by George Soros, for example, who's a British agent, or Malek Brown of the British Colonial Office, are the biggest drug runners in the world today. And they destroy people, as the way that China was destroyed in the 19th century by the drug running. If the place to hit the drug traffic is not in the consumption within the country or the growth in the country, the place to hit the drug traffic is the international trade. What crosses the border, get them at the border, as they used to say in Hollywood, cut them off at the pass, get them at the border. And that's where the problem lies. So we can stabilize that area with the right cooperation. We were injured very badly, which I think people in India and elsewhere agree now. And the Taliban problem also is taken into account. We are endangered by the fact we had a Musharraf who may not have been perfect, but he at least was a factor of stability. And the first thing you want to do to save a country is to ensure its stability. If it's flying apart, you're not going to save anything. And the problem now, the Taliban factor, is being used by the British, operating from their base in the vicinity of Afghanistan, to operate the whole operation. If we can bring forces together to recognize that problem, we can bring it under control. Not perfectly. Mrs. Clinton had a good idea, which he went into this area. Peace with Iran is extremely important. You want to control the problem in this area? You've got to work with Iran. You want war with Iran? Don't worry about the nuclear power. That's not the issue. If anybody starts a nuclear war, the world's going to go up in flames. You don't have to punish any one country. It won't do any damn good. Because if you start a nuclear war, it's going to be a thermonuclear war. And guess who will be alive at the end of that?
How about a question from a young lady? Or almost young lady? Well, all right. Felton, you're not a young lady, but I'm calling on you. No jokes about him.
My particular question would go back to the Roosevelt administration. You basically seem to be somewhat critical about it, but it seemed to be one of the most democratized eras in our country. It saved us certainly from the Hoover administration. Number one, it was the first time in America that we had a black cabinet led by Mary McLeod Bethune. In addition to that, basically it brought about serious economic reform, and that it brought Social Security not as a extreme sense of retirement, that was not the intent, but certainly economic relief, the Agricultural Adjustment Association, farmer subsidies, increased housing benefits in slum areas. And then particularly looking at the Obama administration, he seems to be a prototype of Roosevelt, especially in the context that, first of all, he's a new president. I think the verdict is too early out to basically say that he's a failure, as well as his advisors. But at least he has a vision for a future of economic reform. If you could speak to those issues, why you think that the Roosevelt administration, number one, was a failed policy, and the president's Social Security and other economic benefits, and why you're so critical of the Obama administration, especially when you think Hillary Clinton was so wonderful after all.
Frankly, there's nothing good about Obama at this time, since he left for London. And he's not his own man. He's a puppet. And he's controlled by a bunch of people around him. The only way you can save Obama, and without losing the nation at the same time, is to put him under adult supervision and take away that crowd of fascists, that Nazi types, and the so-called behaviorists, and Larry Summers. Get them out, and then there are options. If you don't get them out, I don't think there are any options. You may go to hell. None.
If I could just have a counter question, are you promoting the idea that if he needs adult supervision, this is a sort of era of infantilization? Is he more like a child, or can he not think for himself? Is he not seen as a serious leader? I mean, being a Harvard graduate and also coming out of Columbia.
He cannot think. He cannot think for himself. I've seen that. He can't think for himself. He's a narcissist type. He doesn't know what he's saying half the time. He's saying words for self-adulation. And in a university environment, you get some people who can pass the course. They study to pass the course, they rehearse to pass the course, but they end up knowing nothing. Obama learned how to pass the course. And he's had a real problem. He's got an ego problem, which is not just an ego problem. It's a pathological problem. But knowing such types, and you have to be precise in this matter, knowing such types, if he's under adult supervision by a group of peers who constitute the presidency, it can work. Remember that our presidency is not based on an individual president. Roosevelt and Lincoln were geniuses. It's different. But our presidency is based on an in-depth organization of the presidency itself as an institution. Obama is running loose away from the presidency. He's not responding to the presidency. He's out on his own with not a clear idea in his head on anything. He's like having a lunatic loose in the thing. But if you put this guy under adult supervision, he's a smart guy to adapt to his environment, as you see from his university record. He'll adapt. But therefore, you have to control what is he's being adapted to. On his own, he is a disaster for all humanity. And on his own, there is no remedy for that.
Next question. Dick.
Mr. LaRouche, I think as I said to you earlier, universities are the place for dissent. And I have to dissent from your view. and I don't need the applause, my dissent is this. If you provide us with an intellectual reason for ascribing to any of our humanity that someone who the country elects as a majority vote needs an adult supervisor, that is very demeaning. And I would hope that out of respect for the office that you speak to, if you give me an intellectual reason for that characterization, I would say fine, but you've made an assignation without substance. So I would like you to respond to what is the intellectual basis for your characterization of Mr. Obama?
Well, the two things about him. First of all, is the way he responds to the situation. And the second thing is what he's responding to is what he's not responding to. Right? That's what you've got. Two things to consider at that time. Now, the point is what he's doing as a policy, as his specific economic policy now and his social policy now, is insane. The policy itself is insane. Not only is it insane, but if that policy is successful, we aren't going to have a United States. There won't be a nation. These things, for example, let's take this case of this crazy thing of this behaviorist type, like Larry Summers. This man is evil. That is, we're now in a point of a great world depression. You look at all the figures, everything is collapsing. Why is it collapsing? Well, it's collapsing because we destroyed the productive powers of labor. We went with policies which did not increase the productive powers of labor. What we're getting in this crazy disease problem now, which is going to get worse, is a result of that. This kind of problem, this disease problem, first of all, is a product of globalization, which admittedly he didn't develop. When you get the idea that you're going to globalize the economy by growing food in a country which is not going to eat it, to sell to a country which is going to eat it, and to control the market, world market, by this kind of operation, you're getting the result you're getting. You look at the question of the energy flux density of the economy. Our productivity, as measured in energy flux density, is collapsing. There's no hope for the country if we continue this way. We are on the road to hell. I've gone through this and I've written about this. The facts are clear. We're on the road to hell. Unless if what it looked like when he came in, particularly before he went to London, it looked as though he was going to adapt to a Franklin Roosevelt orientation, as poorly as whatever as he understood it. Now that is workable. That's where your thesis comes in. Presuming he had good intentions, you don't attack him. I didn't attack him as long as I thought he had good intentions. And the policies they had are criminal. They're criminal in their effect. Look at the thing what he says about health care. His statement about his grandmother, things like that. Look at what his policies are on health care. Look at his policies on these things. These are murderous. This is Hitler kind stuff. I mean, this is objectively Hitler kind of stuff. Our policy is always to develop the minds and abilities of our people. And health care is a key issue here. Do we realize what's happening to the health care of the people of the United States now? What has been happening? Well, we came out of the war, we had a general hospital system, which we used as the model for our post-war health care policy. We developed on that model the best health care system essentially in the world for a mass population. We have now destroyed that, or changed the philosophy. We had a protectionist policy of increasing the productive powers of labor in every section of the country. We have neglected and abandoned whole sections of the country. We've confined productive forces to a very limited part of the labor force and the country. We have people who used to commute to work within a half an hour or 15 minutes each way in their community. We now have up to 2 hours, 2.5 hours commuting to and from work in large parts of the country where the production employment is concentrated. Most of the employment is white-collar employment or similar kinds of services employment. We aren't producing our own things. We shipped our industries out. And we shipped them out so they worked at a lower price, but they're also less productive. The Chinese are less productive than we were in our industries. We've lost our machine tool capability. The heart of our economy was in the automobile industry, not because it belonged there, because that was all that was left to speak of. Our aerospace and automobile industry were the heart of our industrial technology. We are now sinking that. We're destroying it. What we need to do is reverse the policy changes which came into effect between 1968 and 1973, and recognized that the policies which we had then in the 1970s and the 1980s were disasters. They led into the equivalent of a depression in October of 1987. Then we had Greenspan with his crazy policy. It completely ruined us with pure gambling, a gambling casino. We now, look at what's happened since then. I proposed an action in July 27th of 2007. It would have worked. A different policy was approached. We're now in a disaster. We are hopelessly bankrupt now. That's the issue. These are concrete facts. And these are all, Volcker comes in presumably as an advisor to the president on banking policy. Now, I don't always agree with Volcker, but he's an honest and capable man. And he's a man, if you disagree with him, you argue with him. You may not come to an agreement, but the disagreement is useful because he's an honest man and he has some understanding of what the subject matter is. Obama dumped him. He dumped all the advisors who were competent and placed them with this bunch of clowns, these behaviorist nuts, all engineered around Larry Summers. And you look at Harry Summers' record, you say, well, this guy is a guy you can trust? I knew him from the Clinton administration. He was a disaster there. He was the guy that destroyed Glass-Steagall. We wouldn't have the mess we have today but for his effect in Glass-Steagall. These are all concrete acts, decisions. They're subject to reason. And my examination of this, from a standpoint of reason, is this is disaster. If Obama were humble, at least a reasonable degree of humility, and after all, Abraham Lincoln was pretty humble, but he knew what he was doing, but he had humility toward people around him. He put up with a cabinet that was a mess in order to get the country pulled together. So the fact of the matter is the present policy of the United States is toward doom. And we are in worse situation than we were under Bush, not better. And my conviction is that if Obama was with his narcissist tendency, with that tendency, if he's under control of a peer group control of competent people in his cabinet and around the federal system itself, we can't, because we don't want to kick a person out of the presidency after they've just been elected. Therefore, we find a way of controlling the situation and use him and let him be happy in being used in the sense of still being president. It's the best thing I can offer.
We'll take two more questions, here and then here. Yes, we'll take three more questions, Gerald. You can have the last one. You're welcome.
If we are headed towards economic disaster at this juncture, and we may very well be, I somehow do not think that Barack Obama has been the man driving that bus. And with all due respect to you, I didn't find anything in your answer to Dick of specificity about policy in regards to Barack Obama. I didn't find any specificity at all. I wasn't even going to engage that. I had a completely different question, but I had to comment on it. I generally agree with you on the need to look at things in this world in a far more global manner, and that the Middle East, the way that you premised your discussion about the Middle East not being the center of this issue, but rather being a component of the larger world issue, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that if European and nations in the United States put more pressure and had constructive efforts, that we could solve some of the problems there. But, and I also agree with you in terms of, I didn't think you used the word, but I think what you were pointing towards was a concept of oligarchy that exists in the world with these corporate conglomerates that control everything.
Yeah.
Yet where I have a great difficulty is that you seem to think that Obama or Franklin Roosevelt or anybody else in this day and age can somehow pull many of these world leaders together into a room and wave a magic wand, or through their wisdom and humility, get people to buy in. I mean, oligarchs are about power and money. And how are you going to change that fundamental cultural problem, that fact. What are you going to do about that? And I mean, and within that, you stated that, a democratic process, a party process, is about compromise. And I know a little bit about the history of the American political system, and it has primarily been one of conflict. Roosevelt did not get what he got done very easily. I mean, did he get a lot done? Sure he did, but it was not simple for him. And in terms of, you talked about Hamilton and a credit system, and he most definitely created a monetary policy, and Hamilton's goal was to create a United States in the image of Great Britain. He looked towards Great Britain. He wanted to create a manufacturing society. So, I find your extrapolation on history overall, a lot of the specificity to be pretty off the mark. I mean, I would really love to hear what my colleague who studies British Empire thinks.
Well, actually, the introduction of industrial society occurred in England under the direction of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin led the team which started the canal, coal, etc. business of central England. He was also associated with Watt and others who were part of the same team. So you had a French-British crowd. Remember, my ancestry is also partly English, and also some Scottish, and a bit of French, and a taint of Irish here and there. Right? So that's not a problem for me. The British people are not a problem for me, the English people. They have problems enough of their own without having problems for me. However, the government, the management, the oligarchy is a problem. In this case, you've got to understand the role of leadership. We live in a society in which has been influenced by the Paolo Sarpi, with the decline of Aristotelian society, which is no damn good. But you had the introduction of Paolo Sarpi's system, which we call liberalism today. And liberalism, as in the case of people like John Locke, for example, who's an example of this, and he engaged in the slave trade. That was his mentor. And he was often accused of being the author of our system of government. He was not. He was a slave trader. He was evil. Then you had others who, these...
Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he was a slave trader.
I know that's his weakness, wasn't it? And it showed up later. It showed up in his presidency, and it showed up, he began to correct it in the time after the War of 1815. He changed his views under the influence of the incumbent president and John Quincy Adams. Now, there's a continuity. See, you're dealing here not with just personalities, you're dealing with ideas and the generation of ideas. There are certain ideas which work, and ideas are always the action of the individual mind. The discovery of principle is always an action of an individual mind. And the best leaders are those who, in a time of crisis, as individual minds, are able to be the spark plug of ideas which organize society in response to confidence in their leadership to get things done. This is not the usual thing. We had very few U.S. presidents who were really geniuses. We had a few. We had some who were geniuses some of the time and not at others also. McKinley was, in a sense, a genius. He was also a weakling in some respects. But his killing was a disaster for our nation. The key thing is ideas. The key thing is principles. The problem is that under liberalism, we look at this thing as pieces that are scattered about. We pull some pieces together. It's a so-called democratic process. It's not really democratic. It's liberalism. It's the denial of the knowledge of scientific principle. For example, what do we teach in science as an example of problems? What we teach generally is mathematical formulas, or mathematical formulations, backed up by experiments which demonstrate that that formula happens to work. Or we develop a formula that, according to something that does work. But we do not usually think, as classical scholars did, since Plato and so forth, we don't think in terms of the discovery of the principle of something which is outside the experiment itself, but which demonstrates how it's controlled. And when you're designing a change in society, and we're talking about a period now of change, you have to introduce considerations which are contradictory to the underlying axiomatic assumptions of society today. Why are we in a mess? For example, let's take the case of my expertise in forecasting. I've been forecasting the U.S. economy since middle of the 1950s, and I've always been right. And everyone who's forecast contrary has always been wrong. Why? Because our people think forecasting is statistical forecasting. They think that you can deduce a trend in the economy by following the monetary and correlated kinds of considerations. I say no. From my study of economy, my forecasting is based on that we, by adopting certain assumptions, which we call policies, whether we are conscious of these policies or not, that those assumptions steer us repeatedly into crises. Any assumption which is based on the assumption that money is a determinant of value is such a case. Money is not a determinant of value. It is in the minds of some people. It's their response to it as if it were value. But when you look at a physical economy, you find it's not true. To use money as a medium of exchange, yes, it's a good idea. It's a necessary idea. But to assume that therefore the money and the value of money determines value is wrong. That's why I've always been successful in forecasting, because I know that certain policies which have been adopted determine the life cycle of certain developments, not monetary or statistical trends. And therefore the important thing in government, especially in time of crisis, is recognize if we have a crisis, it's because our thinking was wrong. And you need an idea which not only changes the way we think, but which is a correct change, or at least a useful one. Right now, the thing is, we have a monetary system. You have idiots are trying to fix up the monetary system, adjust it, by going into tremendous debt, hyperinflationary debt. We're generating a hyperinflation like Weimar Germany out of this kind of so-called debt policy. And therefore, you're going to see a hyperinflation very quickly in the United States if this thing continues. We'll blow up with hyperinflation. We're on the verge of that right now. You'll find admission of an inflationary tendency now coming forth, just as in Germany under Weimar conditions. First, you get a depression. Now you sink the production. Then you put in money to try to keep the economy going, to pay debts, refinancing debts. So now you have your production is falling, your monetary aggregate is rising. But that accelerates the process. So now you begin to collapse more, as in Germany in the early 1920s. Then you accelerate the monetary emission as credit in order to compensate for that. Then you get hyperinflation. We are now at the pivot point of a hyperinflationary explosion if we continue the present policy. And the President of the United States is determined to continue that policy. There are some people in our community who are supposed to be the economic advisors of the President who have been excluded, who understand this, but they've been excluded along with these nuts associated with the behaviorist economists and Larry Fried. This is the problem. So in a time of crisis, it is not opinion, it is not averages, it is not trends that count. What counts is very precise understanding of what the wrong policy has been and what the correct change is. That's our situation now. I could get us out of this mess if I were president. No problem with that. And I have the people I'm associated with now in our discussion of these matters who are formerly part of this group that was supposed to advise the president. We could solve the problem. We would go with a credit system, as I described it. A Hamiltonian type of credit system, as what the Constitution really means, contrary to some other interpretations. On that case, we would have to generate, at this point, to save the civilization, we'd have to think in terms of periods of credit at low interest rates of 50 to 100 years. Because what you have to do, there's no way we can bail China out. China's on the road to go to hell. And the only way you can bail China out is to realize they've got a fundamental problem. There are a lot of poor people in there. And what they were doing was something which was actually fake. It was short-term. To use China as a substitute for production of American goods and similar kinds of goods. Now that has collapsed. The market for that production has collapsed. The United States has collapsed in terms of its ability to do that. There's no market for those Chinese goods. What's the market for? The only market lies in infrastructure, basic economic infrastructure of a type that develops a higher technological level in the Chinese population. You're talking about 2 generations or more. Russia is not a population problem. Russia is a development of raw materials. Under the Russian territory and associated parts of the former Soviet Union, one of the greatest concentrations of resources on this planet. Those resources can build up the economy of the world. So you have a combination of India, China, Russia. Japan comes in automatically. Korea comes in automatically. So therefore, we can, if we organize a system of credit at between 1.5% and 2% interest, simple interest, on a long-term basis, through treaty agreements of the type we do with our treaty negotiations, we could create the credit. And I know personally we could get from Russia in particular, we could get the agreement to go with that kind of a program. If we did that, we would immediately turn the tide on the present process. The process is not a statistical process. It should not be seen as statistical. It is actually just making policy decisions, particularly involving credit, which enable us to steer the world economy in a direction. Because with the way we're going now, there's nothing in the system, the way it's going now, that's going to save us from a general breakdown crisis. It's the first general breakdown crisis in all modern history.
All right, 2 more. Gerald will get to you. 2, down here. Okay. Oh, well, wait a minute. What? Wait a minute. Raise your hands, the ones that want to ask questions. You already recognized, did I? No. All right, we have, well, all right, Gerald, you've got the microphone. You're next, and I'll try to come back.
Hi, I'm Gerald Duquette. I teach in political science. I don't claim to be the brightest bulb on the Christmas tree, but I really have tried hard to listen and pay attention to the lecture. I tried to take some notes. And I'm struck by the difficulty of listening to your remarks because someone who's trying to listen critically is sort of interrupted every few minutes with some personal characterization that you throw in as some type of fact. And while I'm trying to understand your argument, you tell me some guy's a disaster, or he's the evil, or he's the devil, or some other thing that I personally couldn't ascertain through any methods that I know of. So I wonder if you have superpowers, or and the problem is that I'm distracted from what might well be a fine argument. And as I'm listening and struggling to get past characterizations that I know to be foolish to sort of get to the meat of your argument, I ask myself, how would I grade a student presentation with this kind of material in it? What would I do if a student claimed to know that a person is evil or is a total disaster, or the sort of over-the-top characterizations of individuals, which I don't understand how there could be a basis, in fact, for such characterizations. My question to you is, tell me, a classroom instructor, how your style of delivery, which may be masking arguments that I would have thought interesting, how that's helping students in the audience to understand how to make cogent arguments. In other words, my problem isn't that you're making crazy arguments. Your remarks about the Middle East are not only conventional, they're very common. So there's nothing unique about those. But they were interesting and at some level thoughtful. But your characterizations from start to finish of various people, from Bismarck to everybody, you seem to have knowledge of things that only they in their minds could know. I thought it was interesting that you characterized as factual people's intentions. And so I wonder, when I'm trying to explain the difference between facts and subjective criteria, how is your lecture going to help me? How are you going to help me to teach undergraduates to think clearly and not to take specific instances and imbue them with worlds of significance, or not to make comments about someone's personality you couldn't possibly have substantive knowledge of and then call that a piece of factual data? So, in other words, I'm distracted by all that. How can you cut through all that and tell me what you really want to say?
Well, I told you what I really wanted to say. Okay, no, it's very simple. You're underestimating what I do and what I base this on. That everything I've said is based on fact, is based on my experience with this process, which most people in this room are not experienced with. But it's my business to represent what I know. Now, in a situation like this with a limited time scale, you have two problems. You have to say what is true, and you have to say it in a summary fashion, and don't say if it's not true. That's my standard. I've said nothing to you, I've said nothing to this audience which is not factually true to my knowledge.
Your knowledge?
That's right.
You don't understand the difference between truth and fact, then?
I do.
Because you can't factually characterize someone's intentions unless you are in their head.
Oh, yes, you can.
Oh, no, you can't.
Well, sometimes we do that with, sometimes,
I hope that any student in the audience is not being fooled by that insane comment.
it's not insane.
That it is a fact that I am now intending something.
Well, how do you tell the opinion of a toad and a centipede? Can you talk to either of them?
Is that a non sequitur?
No, it is not. I mean, the point is, how do you tell the intention of a toad? That's by the way in which the actions are organized. You see, the point is, no, those are facts. No, you misunderstand facts. Now,
Why should I be different than he? He didn't come here to hear you talk.
now you.
Gerald, thank you for letting him answer. He's going to answer now. Thank you very much. Yeah, Gerald.
Oh, no, you maybe I have. You just haven't listened to it. Now listen, Gerald. Listen. Hey, quiet down. Calm down. Well, get calm. It's good for you. It's better for your cardiac health, well-being. The point is, what you're dealing with, we're dealing with a society which you're talking about and defending, and very angry about the fact that I've impinged my views on it. Because you're talking about a liberal view of fact and reality. I don't accept the liberal view of fact and reality. In fact, I know better. That, for example, take a case, you probably know something about this. Take the case of dynamics. What's the difference between Descartes and Leibniz? What is Leibniz's attack on Descartes? Why is Descartes a faker? Because of the method he uses, which is the method you're defending. The assumption of self-evident fact, as if it were a little ball being kicked around someplace. What determines the course of history is, and as in physical processes, is what's called dynamics. This is not something I invented. This is well known in history, for example, in the work of the Pythagoreans and Plato. The concept of dynamis. It's the concept of Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, in the concluding paragraph of his defense of poetry. That there are dynamical processes, as he emphasizes, in the creative moments of mankind, where we see a principle being expressed by a population. But not all the people who express that opinion, as a result, share the motive which leads to it. And yet the greatest moments in history come from that kind of inspiration. Therefore, there are certain kinds of ideas which empiricists do not accept, as you don't.
Well, just use a different word then.
No, it's not.
You use a word that has a meaning that you don't agree with. Everyone else hears fact. They thought that you were talking about a fact.
I am talking about a fact.
Now you're talking about a dynamic truth.
That's it. No, dynamics is a fact.
No.
Well,
No, there's a definition for the word fact, and you're not using it.
I don't.
All I'm asking you is use the right word.
Gerald, maybe I can convince the people here to have you give the first lecture next year, and then we can listen to you. Let him answer, and we'll go to the last one. Gerald, you had your say. Answer him briefly, and we'll go to two more questions.
Okay. Well, look, the point is, you don't understand or accept the concept of dynamics. What you're expressing, what you're doing.
All right, we're going to the next person for the question. Yes, right. Yes, here, right here, and then we'll go back. You're already in the back. We're coming to you next because we haven't had a lady yet. No, wait a minute. We're going back first, then you're going to ask the last one.
I thought that was the last one.
No. You put yourself, Gerald, out. All right, Gerald, we're going on. Please, Gerald. Gerald, you're part of our good faculty here. Yes, thank you. Here. Next question. Next question. Next question.
Shysters say stuff that's ridiculous. Get in there and try to help show some reality. You're making that part of my job.
You've told us that 6 times. Next question.
Yes, I would like to return to something Mr. LaRouche said earlier. Would you explain to, for those who might not know, what the Julian the Apostle, apostate philosophy is being used by the British oligarchy?
Yeah. This is a general principle of imperial oligarchy, which is, Julian was not unique in this, but he's famous for it, and therefore he's much quoted because he's the simplest illustration of the case. He's such a clear-cut case that he's used by the British and others to explain the point. What has happened is the use of religion and beliefs which have the character of religious choices as opposed to scientific choices as a basis for organizing conflict in society. And thus, by using these differences to put one part of society against the other, you're able to distract the attention of society from the common issue, the problem of society, and you're distracted by fighting one another over these issues, these so-called religious issues. For example, in the history of religion, or the modern history of religion, the concept of ecumenicism, as in Cousé's notion of de pace fide, the peace among religions, is an essential principle of the state, of society. You must have peace among religions, because that is the way, the disruption of peace among religions is the way in which mankind is set against mankind. Therefore, you can allow religions, but you cannot allow them to be used to one group of people to attempt to destroy the other, particularly within the same society. Now, you have, in addition to religions, you have phenomena which have a religious character, such as liberalism. Now, take the case, what is liberalism? And in this room, I think everybody's been exposed, heavily dosed, to liberalism, because this is what is taught in most universities and is most popular in English-speaking society and other parts of society, as distinct from a very special kind of liberalism called positivism. And in these societies, Paolo Sappi based himself on the religious irrationalism of a medieval character. And this was his system of society. His argument was, and the argument of his Galileo and other followers and accomplices of Sappi, is that mankind must not be allowed to know principles, such as scientific principles. However, what Sappi did, which is why he was able to defeat the Aristotelians in the period of the religious war from 1492 to 1648, was he said that what was happening in that period was that the influence of Cousé's reform, as carried out by people like Louis XI and carried out by Henry VII of England, that these reforms had promoted a great spirit of innovation in the people who had been largely treated as serfs. And you had, especially centered in the cities, and a movement which was unleashed by Louis XI of France and also by Henry VII in England. The ordinary people, the serf-like people of the cities and the countryside, who had been oppressed as serfs, now were participating in the process of innovation. And as was, and Machiavelli pointed out in his military studies, what had happened was that the armies of the Habsburgs, in particular, going into the field of battle with serried ranks as they were supposed to be, were losing the war while winning many of the battles. And the reason was the ordinary people, as was pointed out by Machiavelli, the ordinary people of the cities as artisans were now becoming innovative. And therefore, in dealing with the Habsburg attacks, they were able to innovate in ways which outwitted the dumb organization of the troops of the Habsburgs. So what the compromise that came up with Sappi said, okay, we will allow innovation, we will not allow science. We will not allow Cusa, Nicholas Cusa, which is science. We will allow mechanical innovation, or we will selectively allow it if we don't think it's bad for us. And we will use that, that toleration for innovation, which is what is called the Anglo-Dutch liberal principle, which dominates the United States thinking in universities and elsewhere today. We will allow people to innovate and to come up with mathematical formulas, but we will now let them come up with the concept of principle as such. And that's the point. Now, this was the issue between these liberals and actually Kepler, who discovered gravitation. They didn't. And Leibniz, who developed modern science. They didn't. And Riemann, who actually developed modern science further, and they didn't. And Einstein, who defended these guys from Kepler through Riemann, and they didn't. And so therefore the idea of principle as such, as a concept, as a factual concept, does not exist in liberalism. And when you come up with a proof of principle of this type, which is alien to liberalism, you get a liberal freak out over the fact that you've raised something which is provable, and they say it's not provable because it's not a fact in the sense of liberalism as Paolo Sappi defined it. And that's what the issue is.
All right. We're going to take the final question. The young lady. No, wait a minute. You need a microphone. You need no, you need a microphone.
Hello? Okay.
That's better.
I'm just trying to resolve the conflict. If Mr. LaRouche had said, in talking about certain people, I have studied this person, I have studied what this person has said and done, and based on my observations and my experience, I conclude that this person is acting like you fill in the blank. The trouble with brilliant people is they're 2 steps ahead of the ordinary thinker, and they don't like to explain themselves, I think, based on my experiences.
Well, what you say is a principle is absolutely true, and that's exactly what I've done. However, I also stated some very important principles which are strange to some people because they haven't heard this kind of argument perhaps before. And therefore, what they want, they need more elaboration. And I can give it. I've given it in things I've published. I have said nothing here in terms of principle, which I have not said many places, and I've presented the proof of this thing. In the case, for example, the study of Obama. I did an extensive study of Obama in an area which I have specialized qualifications. I reckon.
How long have you studied him?
What?
He just became president. How long have you ever studied?
I've studied him for long before he became president.
I look forward to that publication.
I want to read that.
Yeah, it's already been said. I gave a 3.5-hour webcast.
Academics have standards, sir. And if you
This was. You've got a problem, Gerald. You can't listen.
Well, let him. You want to finish, Linda?
I just finished quickly. It's just
All right, he's going to finish the answer.
okay. I've already published. It's on record. Extensive studies in detail. As I say, I just gave on the 11th of this past month. I gave a 3.5-hour presentation to a group of leading scholars and others on these kinds of questions. There's no mystery about it. They're documented. It's available on the public record. And when I present a summary here, in a short period of time, I identify what I've said. And the backing for what I've said as to how I reach these conclusions is in the public domain. It's widely available in the public domain. I've gone through all the stages you indicated, and it's available to anyone. They got a question, postpone the freak out until you've looked at the evidence.
Gerald, if you want the citation, come up here.
Why can't you just tell us from the podium? I can write it down, go to the library.
Gerald, you can walk. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lyndon LaRouche.